3 words, survival horror fans. 3 words. Scary as hell. These days, many fans would argue that Fatal Frame 2 isn't just the best game in the series overall, but also the scariest. It's also arguably the most popular game nowadays, but how did it fare when it came out? Once again, let's dive into some reviews that came out when Fatal Frame 2 released in NA on December 9th, 2003, and EU on April 30th, 2004. So, the IGN review for this game came out on November 19th, 2003, about 2 weeks before the game's public release. It opens with that scary as hell quote from the start of the video, which may be all you need to know about this one. But let's look a little further. They really seem to like this game. Bigger, longer, and scarier than the original, Butterfly not only manages to do exactly what it sets out to do, it also succeeds in becoming one of the best pure adventures on the PlayStation 2 thus far. In fact, it's probably only eclipsed by the stellar Silent Hill series, and even that could just be a matter of opinion. Absolutely wild praise. At any rate, the review continues by describing the story a little, and it's interesting to note that they state that this game takes place 30 years before the original. At some point, it does appear this game was intended to take place much earlier in the timeline, but then it got bumped up to after Fatal Frame 1, so I guess reviewers were still working with that old information. Make no mistake about it, it's one of the scariest video games that we've ever played. The glaze is real. At any rate, they praise the combat system as being an improvement over the first game. Not that that's hard, and note that there's improved difficulty to the game this time around as well. The first one, in their eyes, was too easy, but this one is balanced much better. But like everyone who has held a controller while playing this game, they do note that escorting Mayu around is quite the frustrating experience. They also argue that Mio, when running, still only reaches roughly Jill Valentine's walking speed. So yeah, don't expect to make your way around the map too quickly. However, between the terrific storytelling, intriguing battle system, and challenging yet immersive puzzles, these small little hitches aren't nearly enough to make us forget about the game's overall quality. And for those heavy into their graphics at the time, they also note, more technical graphic fiends, however, may take umbrage with the fact that the game sports lower character polygons when compared to the PS2 versions of Silent Hill and Clock Tower 3. Also substandard is the resolution used for textures, which are actually quite detailed, but lack the crispness of more modern video games. The horror. But overall, incredibly high praise from IGN's corner. Did other outlets feel the same way? GameSpot released their review on December 10th, so the day after the game released. They gave it an 8.2 out of 10, noting, while the game isn't terribly difficult and doesn't create an entirely new mold for itself, it still manages to weave an unsettling tale, full of secret sacrificial rites that draws you inexorably deeper. They note that it plays much like the first game, although this time around, you thankfully get infinite of the lowest grade film, so you can more freely take photos of things of interest, like during puzzles and such. This also allows you to save your best film for actual combat. On that note, they take the opposite stance to IGN and feel that the combat in this game is actually too easy because of the better camera and film, and the first game was harder. It's too bad, since the original game pitted you against tough spirits that would have been a welcome challenge. The lack of difficulty salts away at the notion of survival horror, since surviving is generally not very hard at all. Twin waifs get terrorized by flying kimonos and rolling balls while chasing glowing butterflies in this prosaically paced shocker that goes for the brain instead of the throat, with lackluster results. So begins the GamePro review that came out on December 11th, 2 days after the game's release. Yeah, unlike IGN, these guys didn't seem to like it too much, noting, "Its hair-raising visual creep-outs and deft handling of foreboding folklore are undermined by a steadfast reliance on survival horror genre trappings and boring gameplay execution." Overall, these guys take umbrage with the fact that the game just doesn't try to do anything new. Same old camera angles, same old puzzles, same old key retrieval. There is apparently just way too much backtracking and revisiting the same locations, and not enough actual scares for it to stand up to the likes of Resident Evil and Silent Hill. Ouch. But really, where are the lies? I'm also not a big fan of backtracking myself. They do praise the story, however, and note that it's definitely meant to be played late at night with the lights off. Then you can just enjoy the atmosphere and heartbreaking story, even if the game doesn't otherwise present much else that's new. On the same day, GameSpy also shared their review, giving it a 4 out of 5. Fatal Frame 2 is the prequel to last year's Fatal Frame. The action here takes place years before the supposedly true events that were recounted in the first game. Again, seems a lot of folks were working with the old information here about when Fatal Frame 2 was actually set, which is kind of interesting to see now in hindsight. Movement, thankfully, is like that in most action games. You move in whatever direction you push the left stick. The game is unsettling enough without having to deal with a non-intuitive Resident Evil style way of getting around. Again, I think a lot of people today tend to hand wave away how much people hated tank controls back in the day. Here's yet another example of that. But they do also note that non-tank controls are a hassle all of their own, and there's a reason they exist. After all, the constantly changing camera angles means often you'll be running one direction and the shot will shift to an opposite angle view. As a result, your forward movement becomes a backwards movement. I also like that this reviewer was asking for survival horror co-op way before Resident Evil finally implemented it into the main series. I have no idea how that would work, considering you only have one camera, and 2 people playing together negates much of the fear, which is also the problem later Resident Evils had, but hey, if they could have found a decent way to make it work, I'm always down to try. In January 2004, Game Informer shared their review of Don't Pee Your Pants. Thanks, I wasn't planning to, but now that you've mentioned it, I definitely won't. That being said, they adored the game, claiming, Fatal Frame 2, Crimson Butterfly is, without a doubt in my mind, the scariest game ever made. Very high praise. Their one issue, as with many reviewers, seems to be with the battle system. Not necessarily that it's too easy, as some have argued, but because so many people complained about the first game's camera, Tecmo made sure to change this one, and they personally weren't a fan of the upgrades. Its execution is confusing and convoluted, and I felt like it took away from the being there feel that the rest of the game so skillfully achieves. Meanwhile, over in Europe, Eurogamer put out their review on April 29th, 2004, the day before its EU release. What a lovely backhanded compliment it is when someone says you're photogenic, when what they really mean is, you don't look anywhere near as good as that in real life. Sigh. Project 02, for us, merely reinforces the principle that some things in life really shouldn't be photographed. Indeed. And interestingly, while IGN kind of shat on the graphics, Eurogamer goes in the opposite direction, praising how consistently amazing they are, with highly textured environments and amazing lighting and particle effects. In combat, the use of simple but effective graphical trickery induces a sense of panic that even Silent Hill can't compete with. Different strokes for different folks, I guess. A common trend across a lot of these reviews, though, is the lack of any real gameplay innovation with this sequel. In fact, survival horror as a whole wasn't really changing too much at the time, and as Eurogamer notes, in a sense, this isn't a criticism as such as the same issues apply to the entire Resi Evil and Silent Hill series, and there's arguably a whole lot more innovation going on here than either of those. But it still feels like you're playing largely the same game in a different setting. Is that necessarily a bad thing? Well, that's up to you to decide. Some people like the familiarity of picking up a sequel and knowing it's going to be more of the same thing, but in a slightly different setting. I'm generally one of those people. But if you want fantastic alterations and innovations with each subsequent game, yeah, this era wasn't going to deliver what you were after all that much. And, once again, let's wrap up with a few print reviews at the time. PlayStation Magazine's February 2004 issue states, I found Crimson Butterfly's premise to be less scary than the original games. Perhaps it's the ancient Japanese village setting. I was able to overcome the cultural barrier of the Japanese mansion in Fatal Frame, but adding a barrier of time as well as culture, well, it's just too far removed from my life. I guarantee, if this game were set in the suburban Midwest, it would make me weep like a little girl. That, is a bold choice, not gonna lie. Australia's PlayStation 2 magazine, April 2004 edition states, The Lost Village is harder to escape than Raccoon City or Silent Hill. Crimson Butterfly is the prequel to the largely unnoticed but equally brilliant, for its time, Project Zero. Even in its almost complete state, Crimson Butterfly is more disturbing than Resident Evil or Silent Hill. It's a mind-bender, with fantastically edited cutscenes and gameplay utilizing inner fears rather than gore. There's just no way to escape the comparisons. They are the kings of the genre after all. But it's interesting to note that, even at the time, Fatal Frame was considered underrated. It never did reach the heights many of us felt it should have, no doubt thanks to its unique Japanese setting. The May edition of the same magazine also notes, the first Project Zero was released to minimal fanfare, but it wasn't long before it was being touted as one of the scariest games of all time. Unlike the traditionally acknowledged leaders of the genre, Silent Hill and Resident Evil, there is very little blood and gore. This game doesn't merely repulse or cause you to jump out of your seat, but uses a subtle mixture of both to leave you feeling as if there is something just over your shoulder. Like some of the best horror, it relies more on what you can't see rather than what you can. And Hyper Magazine's August 2004 edition makes an interesting observation I feel like a lot of modern gamers will agree with. The only thing we would have liked to have seen is less of a reliance on scripted events. Combined with poor game direction, you'll find yourself stuck at times, wandering around until you step in the right zone to trigger the next major event. A flaw that also plagued the original game. They did, however, give it an overall score of 85 out of 100. Not bad. And that's a look at just some of the reviews for Fatal Frame 2 that came out with the game's release. Over 20 years have passed since then. 2 whole decades. What do you guys think? Do you agree with their assessments? Were they too harsh or not harsh enough on some aspects? Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I'll see you again next time.